The joys of rediscovering old telly. Hello and welcome to this week's video. Now this week I just wanted to do something slightly different and just talk about old television. Now, if you follow this channel at all, you know I love old TV. You know I'm not terribly impressed by a lot of modern TV. At this time I want to talk about rediscovering old television. Now, in like the last 9 or 10 years, I've become even more of a cult follower of old television, and I've discovered things that I've never seen before. Like 2014, the first of these was probably in 2014 when I took a punt on getting the DVD sets of Callan, the late 60s, early 70s British spy thriller series with Edward Woodward, and I love Callan. It was an absolutely fantastic show, and that spurred me on to continue to find new things from a long time ago that I may have heard of, I may not have heard of, but which I've never seen before. Now obviously it doesn't always work. Sometimes you get something and you're like, not that bothered. But I've unearthed many things that I absolutely love, as well. The highlights of which are probably The Sandbaggers, the late 70s, early 80s spy thriller series with Roy Marsden. Secret Army, the late 70s BBC World War II drama about a resistance group in Nazi-occupied Brussels, which obviously I've done a full video on. Just of late, I picked up the Blu-ray set of the 70s detective show The Rockford Files, which I'm enjoying enormously. But what I want to talk about in this video is more rediscovering shows that you saw before, possibly when you were a kid or a teenager, and either really liked or loved, or were just kind of a staple part of your television, and yet disappeared for many years. Now I get that in a lot of these cases, a lot of this is perhaps down to my own personal experience, because I emigrated to Australia when I was a teenager, and a lot of these shows disappeared precisely because of that, because they may still have been mainstay repeats on British television, but they weren't on Australian, so I didn't see them again for a very long time. Now again, there are exceptions, but that's that's often the case. Now, talking really early, shows like Robin of Sherwood, V, and Soap, I saw them as a kid, a pre-teen, and when they were gone, they were generally gone. Unless you could really afford expensive blank tapes and tape them, which I couldn't. Once they were gone if they weren't repeated. Now, in some of these cases, it wasn't actually that long before they came out on VHS. Except as a kid, 5 or 6 years is a freaking eternity. The difference between not seeing something from when you were 10 years old to when you were 16 seems like 20 years to me now. Robin of Sherwood started coming out on VHS. I think it was even in the late 80s, very early 90s. Again, it wasn't really that long. It was maybe 4, 5, 6 years for some of them, but obviously at the time, to me, that was a really long time and felt like a really long time. The same applies to V, although that's even longer. V, especially the original miniseries, would have been something like 8 or 9 years. So you're talking 8 to 16. That's a long time when you're a kid. Soap was another one, though in that case the only kind of sample of it I got, I didn't rediscover the whole show. I basically got a snippet of it on VHS. There was a video release called The Best of Soap, which basically had 3 episodes on it. And they were classic episodes, but that's all it was. It was just 3 episodes. But it was enough to kind of remind me, and at that point, it would have been 5 or 6 years, which, as a teenager, is a really freaking long time. It was enough to remind me, no, the memory didn't cheat, it was every bit as batshit crazy and funny as I remembered it being. It took until the mid to late 2000s before I was actually able to get the whole show. Now, an example of these shows that I would imagine were probably mainstays of repeats on British TV, but not so much Australian, were like the Joan Hickson Miss Marples, the Jeremy Brett Sherlock Holmes. So basically, the last I saw of them was around about 1991. And then I didn't see them again until like the early 2000s when they started coming out on DVD over here. I've since upgraded both to the Blu-ray versions. But again, that's a long time. The mid 2000s, again, your stuff like the A-Team, which, at the time, again, hadn't seen for 18 years, 17 years? Again, that's a really long time. Possibly the longest, it's only recently been beaten. The longest at the time was the Little Vampire TV show, which I've talked about before on here. I saw that once on first transmission in the UK, 1986. I loved that show. I was still a kid. I loved that show. I did not see anything hide nor hair of that again till late 2000s, late 2008, 2009. Somebody posted it on YouTube, only it was in German, and I was like, where the hell did you get hold of these? Because they were clearly good copies. And he was like, it's actually got a DVD release in Germany. It was a nightmare to get. It was a nightmare to get. Couldn't find it on eBay. I literally had to go onto a German DVD website and navigate it, which was obviously all in German, in order to be able to buy the thing. And it cost like $100 or something insane like that. I didn't regret it. I still don't regret it, because I loved rediscovering it. It's one of my favorite kid shows. It takes me back to being a kid again. I love that show. For such a long time, I had nothing of that. All I had to even prove its existence was like one of the books, because it was originally a book series. I had like the first book, which was like republished with a little cover of several of the actors from the TV show. Obviously, they republished it to cash in on the TV show. And that was all I had to prove of its existence. I remember even in the early 2000s, when I first kind of gained access to the internet, couldn't find anything of it. I remembered, or at least I thought I remembered, that Michael Gough was in it. And I couldn't even find a trace of it on like any of his career profiles. I'm like, did I bleeding hallucinate this show? But no, apparently no. But around about, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago now, another one I rediscovered was The Incredible Hulk. Again, a mainstay of my childhood, which again I had not seen for a really long time, which I very much enjoyed. One of the most, again, you're getting to the point now where you're rediscovering stuff that I actually saw as an adult, but disappeared in some cases. Wicked Science, of course. I don't know whether you could really say rediscovering a show that was still on in terms of Neighbours, but at least rediscovering the 2004 season, which again I had not seen for 16 years. Both of those shows in 2020. Of course, I've talked about this in the Wicked Science reviews and the 2020 overview, so I won't go over it again too much. But I loved rediscovering them. It was, of course, kickstarted by Bridget Novell's brief return to Neighbours for a grand total of 3 episodes. And I kind of sat there and going, I used to really like her. I still really like her. I wonder if you could actually get those, because I looked for Wicked Science on DVD for several years after it never came out, and eventually I guess I just forgot about it. And it had come out in DVD sets in Spain, and I was able to kind of get hold of the 2004 season from various sources, and I loved it. I know, 2020 Everybody hates 2020 for the obvious reasons. I have very fond memories of 2020 just for that, just for rediscovering them shows. And I basically spent the whole year rewatching them. The last 2 years or so have been absolute shite, but I actually enjoyed. I actually enjoyed 2020. I just stayed inside and and rediscovered those shows. More recently, on Blu-ray, I've rediscovered again some 80s shows. Knight Rider. Magnum is another show I'd not seen since I was a kid. So you're beating stuff like Little Vampire now. You're now talking about shows I've not seen for over 3 decades. In some cases, more than that. And I have to say, I'm really impressed by Magnum. I'm actually really enjoying it. I'm watching like one episode a fortnight, so I'm still on season 1, but I'm really enjoying it. It's especially on Blu-ray, you can see how high the production values are, what a good-looking show it is, and it's really, really enjoyable. Yeah, it's a really good show. You kind of reminded of things, like I loved Higgins as a kid. I thought he was cooler than Magnum. You know what? I still kind of do. Maybe it's because I could never actually see myself as Magnum, but I could see myself being Higgins. what that says about me, I'm not entirely sure. And most recently, another one I rediscovered. Again, we're talking over 30 years. Was the late 80s, early 90s British sitcom Watching, the romantic comedy series. I watched that as a kid. I think I mentioned before. I thought it was the '91 Christmas special, but watching it again, it was actually the season 5 finale. Was I think the last episode that I saw. They showed it in Australia, so they must have showed the rest of series 5. For some effing reason, they never showed the last 2 seasons. Not as far as I'm aware. And season 5 ends on a bleeding cliffhanger. So I was left for 30 years thinking, was that really how that show ended? That's kind of a bummer ending. Really? And of course, it wasn't. Now again, as with so many old shows, and I think it particularly applies to comedies even more than dramas. You're like, is it really going to hold up? Am I going to see it again? Kind of get a nostalgia thrill, but it doesn't really hold up. And and there have been a couple of shows, there have been a couple of cases where I've watched the first episode, I've actually really enjoyed it for the nostalgia thrill, and then even though I enjoyed it, I've not continued watching the show. It's like, yeah, the nostalgia kick was really all I needed, I don't need to watch the rest of the show. But I watched the first episode of Watching, and I was quite happy. I was like, this is actually still pretty good. This is actually still pretty funny. And Emma Ray is certainly still very cute. Probably appreciate her now more than I did then, given that at least for the first season I wasn't even a teenager, so yeah. And again, I kept watching. Now, I was initially going to pace it out over a few years, because I watched like the first season, and then there's a Christmas special at the end of the first season, and I'm like, I think I'll just wait a while. I'll wait and I'll watch the Christmas special at Christmas, and I did. And I was going to kind of do the same with season 2, because I think there were like 4 Christmas specials in total. And I didn't. I just kept watching. And certainly by the time that you got to the latter seasons, I started marathoning the freaking thing. Initially, I was pacing out like 1 episode a week when I started. By the last 3 seasons, I was marathoning the freaking thing, and loving it. I mean, obviously, some of that was because I hadn't seen season 6 and 7, and there's also this huge arc between seasons 5 and the start of season 7. But it's like, I have to be honest, I kind of fell in love with Watching in a way that I haven't really since, the Bridget Novelle revival in 2020. I actually kind of fell in love with that show again. It, and it's something that has basically, up until recently, you've never seen it on my channel. I've never mentioned it before because I haven't seen it for 30 odd years. I had reasonably fond memories of it, but whether it was any good, whether it stood up or anything like that, it was just one of those things you've never really seen again. You don't really think about it that much. It might, and I actually fell in love with the bloody thing again. I mean, more than I did the first time, I think. Yeah. I love rediscover. It's great fun to rediscover old TV that you liked or you loved. Obviously, sometimes you might rediscover something and find out it's actually a bit shit. Or in some cases, like I said, you might get a nostalgia kick off the first episode, but you end up just kind of not. It's almost like not even consciously, but you can't be bothered to watch the rest of it. You've got your nostalgia kick, and that's enough. But in so many of these cases, I've rediscovered these shows, and I've absolutely loved them. It's like, I wish I could find shows made nowadays that I can fall in love with. Oh well. Anyway, that's this video for this week. Me rambling on about my love for old telly. God, I love old telly. I am so old and so out of touch. But that's why you love me, isn't it? That's what I tell myself anyway. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll speak to you again soon. Bye for now.